Welcome everybody to this joint seminar between the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems as organized by Professor Andy Miller and the Center for Urban Environmental Research and Education. I'm Claire Welty, the director of Curie. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Rosemary Knight as our guest speaker today of this joint seminar. Dr. Knight is a professor of geophysics at Stanford University, and she's worked for more than 30 years on the challenge of using geophysical methods for groundwater science and management. In 2008, Professor Knight founded the Center for Groundwater Evaluation and Management with the vision of advancing and promoting the use of geophysical methods through the development of partnerships. Collaboration with local and state agencies, moving knowledge into action has been and remains central to her work. Over the past 7 years, Professor Knight's research group has collaborated with others to advance the adoption of the airborne electromagnetic method to support sustainable management of groundwater in California. So with that, welcome, Rosemary.
Thanks very much, Claire. I am delighted to be here and talking to you all about advancing geophysical methods for groundwater evaluation and management. And here's my geophysical measurement method up in the corner. So today I'm going to be focusing on one specific aspect of groundwater management, and that is recharge, talking about harnessing the power of geophysical imaging to recharge California's groundwater. And I wouldn't be doing any of this without these two people, Sagi Kang, who's a postdoc with me at Stanford, and Meredith Goebel, a research scientist. And is the volume okay? Claire, you can give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, back up. Anyone not familiar with groundwater? Here's my slide of groundwater. I use this schematic a lot. The tree is not to scale. We're typically looking down hundreds of meters below the ground surface where we have groundwater, the water that's held in the openings in the sediments and the rocks down below the ground. And groundwater is super important. It's 97% of all liquid fresh water. And in the past, we've always thought of there being so much groundwater down there. And part of the reason we think there's so much groundwater down there is we cannot see that we are depleting it. But with climate change and population growth, there is increasing concern and increasing awareness worldwide that we are actually depleting our groundwater aquifers. Our water levels are going down. So we need to think very carefully about what we do to manage, monitor, protect the long-term sustainability of our groundwater systems, both the quantity of the water that we have present and the quality of the water. So what has intrigued me for close to, well, more than 30 years now is how do we get the data? How do we get the information we really need to develop the models we need, to develop the understanding we need, to manage to understand our groundwater resources? The traditional way of getting information is drilling wells. And wells give you a lot of information, but right at the location where you drill your well, and only to the depth where you drill your well. So lots of question marks as to what is going on. And if we had a wonderfully homogeneous subsurface, it wouldn't be a problem. But with the spatial heterogeneity that we have in many groundwater systems, we can never drill enough wells to reduce the uncertainty to the level we're starting to need to give us accuracy in our predictions of what different management actions could mean in terms of the long-term viability of our groundwater resource. So what I've been studying for, as I said, 30 years now is a variety of geophysical methods. And these are the different geophysical methods I've worked with in my group, working with surface-based methods, airborne methods, and increasingly we're integrating what we're doing with satellite-based methods. So today, because I was only given 1 hour instead of 10, I'm going to focus on electromagnetic methods, specifically an airborne EM method. That's really going to be most of what I talk about, but there's also a ground-based equivalent that I'll be talking about. So focusing today on our work in the Central Valley of California, there's the Central Valley, Stanford's over here, this large, flat valley, very agriculturally productive, but very low precipitation. Parts of it rate as desert. So here we have agriculture going on in this kind of setting. And much of our work is focused on the San Joaquin Valley, which is the southern part of the Central Valley. The geology of the San Joaquin Valley, we have the Sierras on the east, the Coast Range on the west, and we've got this large trough of sediments that's being filled up over time. There's underlying bedrock from the Sierras. And then really the way to think of the Central Valley is just a mix of sands and gravels, which is where we pump our groundwater from, but a lot of clay. In fact, in places there's much more clay than shown in this schematic. And a lot of what we're dealing with is a lot of fine-grained materials, and then these pathways of coarse-grained materials that weave through this fine-grained material. We tend to have places where we have a clearly defined upper aquifer and a lower aquifer separated by this thick confining unit referred to as the Corcoran clay. So a whole pile of sands and gravels and clays, a very complex groundwater system. So we came to realize about 50 years ago now that we were in trouble. And this shot from Poland at the USGS, he went out and he put markers on a telephone pole in the San Joaquin Valley, showing where the ground level was in 1925 and where the ground level was in 1977. So there's two amazing things about this image. First, that the ground level had sunk 9 meters over this period of time. And it had sunk because of the extraction of groundwater. You're pumping from the sands and gravels, but you're draining those clays, and clay is highly compressible. So much of this subsidence is due to the pumping of, well, all of the subsidence is due to the pumping of groundwater, but most of the compaction is the compaction of the clays. So that's the first remarkable thing I always think when I look at this image. Look at the amount of subsidence. The second truly remarkable thing is what's happened since then? It's just continued. And if we look at the modern day equivalent of monitoring what's happening in the San Joaquin Valley, these are data from the Sentinel-1 satellite. It's an interferometric synthetic aperture radar map, deformation map. Excuse me, I'm just getting over the flu and I'm still struggling with my voice. What this type of measurement does is map out change in elevation of the ground surface. So the satellite revisits a point on the ground surface about every 12 days and monitors a change in elevation with a resolution of millimeters. This is truly a remarkable technology. And what we're seeing here is the amount of deformation that's occurred between January 2015 and September 2019. And we're seeing places where we have deformation up to close to 1.5 meters. So the ground is still sinking in the San Joaquin Valley. This indicates a groundwater system out of balance. So here's my simple schematic of the San Joaquin Valley. We have lots of clays, we have sands and gravels, and we have a water table now down about 30 to 100 meters below the ground surface. And why do we have a groundwater system out of balance? Well, it's not fancy math at all. It's very simple. Water out exceeds water in. And you can't keep that up for too long without seeing your ground level subsiding. So water out is all the pumping that's happening from the sand and gravel units, the water held in the sand and gravel. And water in is due to a process referred to as recharge. So recharge, and I'm going to use it a lot, recharge is the term we use to describe the refilling, the renewal, the adding of water to our aquifer that's going to cause the water levels to rise. And so if we look at natural recharge that's occurring, it's just not keeping pace with the amount of pumping. And natural recharge, as it rains, the water moves through the subsurface, gets down to the water table. It's the snow melts in the Sierras and brings water out into streams. And so we have this focused recharge where we have rivers or lakes and the water moves down into the subsurface. But because we have this imbalance with water out greater than water in, we're really running into serious problems in California. We've got depletion of groundwater supplies. That's fairly obvious. We have dry wells, some of which are shown here. We used to be able to pump from here, but the water level's so low now that these wells are dry. It's having an impact on surface water, the connected surface water, which has an impact on dependent ecosystems. Subsidence of the ground surface, I've already shown you. And that is not just an indicator that the groundwater system's in trouble, so it's very useful in that respect, but it's damaging infrastructure. So the very aqueducts that are moving water from the more water-rich northern part of the Central Valley to the south, it's supposed to be a gravity-driven system. But what happens when you have subsidence? You no longer have your aqueduct performing the way it should. And there's an investment of $350 million being made right now to correct some of these problems. And this excessive pumping without renewal, without recharge, is also impacting water quality because we start draining the clays, and that's a story for another day. So California in 2014 was going through a massive drought, and we had a governor there, and I've heard the description that a good politician never misses a crisis as an opportunity to make change. So here we are with this drought, a great opportunity to convince people that it was time to change the way we are not managing, or we're not managing, groundwater in California. And so the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was put in place that said, all groundwater needs to be sustainably managed. So how do you define sustainable? What is in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is you need to manage your groundwater so as to avoid these 6 undesirable results, or they've also been called the 6 deadly sins of groundwater pumping. You can't have chronic lowering of the water level. So you can't keep pumping and having the water go down, down, down like it was. You can't reduce groundwater storage to some significant and unreasonable level. Saltwater intrusion has to be avoided, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and the impact on interconnected surface water. So clearly in the San Joaquin Valley, where we had all these things going on, we were never going to achieve sustainable groundwater management. There was a need to decrease pumping or increase recharge. And the focus now is on increasing recharge. So let's help nature out. Instead of just waiting for natural recharge to occur, let's start engineering or managing actively the recharge of the groundwater system. And that is a process referred to as MAR, Managed Aquifer Recharge. One form of MAR, and the one I'll be talking about today, is you move excess surface water into an area. So you basically spread the water over the surface, and that gives you additional water that can now move into the subsurface. Now, California's freshwater situation has always involved these 2 extremes: periods of floods, periods of droughts. In California's freshwater future, I am having trouble here. California's freshwater future is just predicted to be more extreme floods and more extreme droughts. And so there's now a lot of interest in thinking about co-management of these 2 extremes. How about capturing the water during the flooding periods and using it for managed aquifer recharge of the groundwater system to either recover from the last drought or prepare for the next? And there's a lot of space in the subsurface in California to do this, to move water into that empty part of the subsurface where water's being removed. In fact, there's numbers in terms of acre feet and kilometers cubed, but we've come up with a new metric. Lake Shasta is the largest reservoir in California. And in terms of available surface water storage in above ground reservoir, we have the equivalent of 9 Lake Shastas. In terms of how much space we have to store water below the ground surface, we have 30 Lake Shastas. So we don't need more above ground reservoirs. We just need to get smart about moving the water into that space we have below the ground surface. So what are possible sites for doing this? Sites for recharge. You can have dedicated recharge basins. There's increasing willingness and enthusiasm among growers in the state to make their farmlands available. This is being referred to as AgMar, agricultural managed aquifer recharge, where the almond groves or the fields are flooded with water and the water moves down below the ground surface. There's also floodplain restoration efforts where we have the multi-benefit of increasing wildlife habitat and also recharging the groundwater system. So recharge is really getting a lot of attention in California. And agencies have been submitting groundwater sustainability plans. They are required to come up with a plan so they will achieve sustainability by 2040 or 2042, depending upon the state of their basin. And in the San Joaquin Valley, 43% of the plans include recharge. And here's the numbers in thousands of acre feet. I should have converted them to Lake Shastas. But the bottom line, people are planning to spend $3 billion recharging. Okay, so what's the challenge? The challenge is figuring out where to recharge so as to maximize the quantity and rate of recharge. Everyone's very enthusiastic about the idea of getting this water from up here down to here, but there are many issues. Land is expensive, so you don't want to just go out and buy land if it's not an optimal site for recharge. Investment in the surface infrastructure is expensive. Luckily, there's a lot of infrastructure that's already moving water around on the ground surface. If you look at a map of the infrastructure in California, you have your major aqueducts, and then you have your irrigation canals, and then you have your irrigation ditches. So there's lots of infrastructure in place that could be utilized to move this water around. Surface water is scarce and valuable, so you don't want to move this water somewhere and not have efficient recharge. And we need buy-in from growers, and they don't want to flood their fields if the water is just going to pond there at the ground surface. When we think about the subsurface, the geologic characteristics of an optimal site is where we have these interconnected pathways of coarse-grained material. So we flood the ground surface, but there's a pathway that's going to allow us to move the water down and reach the water table. We also want a location where ideally we recharge here, but it has regional benefit. So we're accessing a part of the groundwater system that's connected laterally to other parts of the groundwater system. So we need to figure out where the subsurface looks like this. And I come back to my example of we could drill wells, but we really need fast, reliable, cost-effective. So we need to harness the power of geophysical imaging, which brings me to my title. What we are doing is using geophysical imaging to find these interconnected pathways of coarse-grained material. And here's the method I am most enthusiastic about and one of the most exciting days of my life, October 27, 2015, which really changed my research direction at that point. And I have to say, as you'll see as I go through this talk today, has really changed the basis for thinking about sustainable groundwater management throughout the state. So this is the airborne electromagnetic method. It's a helicopter deployed system that moves this large transmitter loop across the ground surface. Current goes through this transmitter loop. It sets up a magnetic field that reaches hundreds of meters below the ground surface. When you terminate the current, it sets up eddy currents. You get a signal that you measure back at your receiver. And this is showing that pilot study back in October 2015. All the data are shown above a Google Earth map just to keep track of where we are. But really what you're looking at is every 30 meters along our flight lines, it's as if we're drilling down 300, 400 meters below the ground surface, mapping out what's there. So what you get from your airborne electromagnetic measurement, those flight lines, what we actually recover from the data is information about how the electrical resistivity of the subsurface is changing. We get an electrical resistivity, like a 2D slice, electrical resistivity into the ground along our flight lines. But we don't want electrical resistivity. We want to understand sediment type. Where's their sand and gravel? Where's their clay? And so the way we've developed to do this, you can use literature values, there's laboratory studies that have studied this, but this linking what you measure to what is there has been central to my research for many years now. And so I became very interested in this problem and realized we don't really want to be using laboratory measurements. We don't really want to be using the relationship between resistivity and sediment type from somewhere else. We want to be doing the experiment right where we're acquiring the data. And so we've developed this method where we work with the driller's logs as close as possible to our flight lines. And so here we have a driller's log that tells us we have sand and gravel, we have clay, we have a mixed, coarse and fine. And we go to locations and we say, here we know it's there, and we know the resistivity that we measured. We know it's there, we know the resistivity that we measured. And we work throughout our study area, model the physics of the measurement. So we set up this whole system of equations saying, if I have sand and gravel here with a resistivity of this is what my airborne EM resistivity measurement will be. So you have all these equations, all these unknowns, you use bootstrapping, and what do you get? You get this remarkable histogram, which is exactly what you'd hope to get. In this area, it's telling us above the water table, resistivity values in this range, this is the distribution of values we obtained for our sand and gravel. And this is the distribution of values we obtained for our clay. And you can see there's some overlap in this distribution, which is not surprising. And below the water table, because water impacts resistivity, we had a mixed unit present here, it all shifts. But we can understand the link between the resistivity that we measure and the sediment type that's there. And typically what we do is determine the most probable. So any resistivity in this range, I would call sand and gravel, but we account for uncertainty. Again, another talk some other day, because even though I'm going to call it sand and gravel, there's a chance there's this mixed unit there, in here mixed, in here clay. And so we can go from this 3D representation of resistivity. This is showing that pilot study. Here are flight lines, slices into the subsurface, looking down 400 meters. Like any of you out there who aren't geophysicists have to be excited by now. You can see 400 meters below the ground surface. And when the water managers started seeing this, they were truly amazed. And we know that our high resistivity units, these warm colors, is where you have sand and gravel. And your low resistivity units is where you have clay. And so you can start thinking about the connectivity in your groundwater system. And specifically to recharge, you can start thinking about how water applied at the ground surface can reach below the ground surface. Okay, so I started working with Graham Fogg, who's a hydrogeologist at UC Davis. And Graham, for years, has been talking about opportunities to recharge in the Central Valley of California at a very large scale. His point is, nature has given us these optimal locations, and what we need to do is take our above the ground infrastructure of moving surface water around and link it to the natural infrastructure. And the natural infrastructure that Graham has been talking about for 20 years now is related to coarse-grained deposits that were formed along the eastern boundary of the Central Valley at the end of the last glacial period. And so these are specific types of deposits, very coarse-grained, very large in scale. And Graham and his student, Gary Weissman, were studying these about 20 years ago and referred to them as incised valley fill deposits. Now, I'm not a sedimentologist. I struggle when I get to this part of the talk, but basically what we're looking at is if the Sierras are over here, we've got the ground surface sloping away out into the Central Valley, and looking at the strike view, turning around and looking towards the Sierras, what we see are these deposits that have occurred over time, and then every now and again, there's this event that incises a valley, and this one at the top would have been the last event, incises this deep valley, And then it's the end of the glacial period. So we have a massive amount of water coming down, moving coarse-grained materials, gravel up to cobble scale, just filling these features with coarse-grained sands, gravels. Cobbles are very distinct in these features. So Gary Weissman and Graham Fogg, his students, mapped out a deposit like this in the Kings River fan through 2 years of detailed surface studying, putting in boreholes, looking at samples, and they mapped out what they felt was the extent of an incised valley fill deposit in the Kings River fan. But they also pointed out that these are likely to be present where we have other major rivers coming into the Central Valley, all throughout the Central Valley. So what we teamed up to do was say, could we find it? So we knew it was there because Gary and Graham had mapped it out. Would we be able to find these deposits with the airborne EM method? Because if so, we can use this method along the eastern edge of the Central Valley, searching for these fast paths, I've started calling them, for recharge that would move surface water deep out to depths far out to depths in the Central Valley. So here's what we did, and the scale here is 20 kilometers. And this is where the Kings River comes out of the Sierras across an alluvial plain into the Central Valley. And what you're seeing is the base map is from Claudia Font's Central Valley hydrologic model. And the red, the warm colors, is showing the percent coarse-grained material. So the Kings River, you can see the path of the Kings River here. The river's in blue, so it snakes down and goes south. But in the past, it has moved all across this area and built up this coarse-grained alluvial fan deposit. Sitting within this coarse-grained alluvial fan deposit is the feature we're searching for, shown between the white dashed lines here. This is where Gary and Graham found this incised valley fill deposit. So what we were searching for was a very coarse-grained deposit in a background of coarse-grained materials. So we lay out our flight lines. Everywhere you see black is where we flew the helicopter. And so very tightly spaced. We did not want to miss this. And we went out and we acquired these airborne EM data. So I just have to pause and acknowledgements. This was a huge undertaking, and huge thanks to the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, who said to me a few years ago, if we were to give you X amount of funding, what would you do? And I said, collect data. I'm one of these scientists that really struggles with writing NSF proposals where you're supposed to be hypothesis testing. It's like, I don't want a hypothesis test. I want to acquire data and see what's down there. So they loved it. So we acquired data to see what's down there. The data were acquired and initial processing. Ted Ash from AquaGeo Frameworks, Gary Weissman helped us out understanding all this. But one thing I just want to mention, in the work I do in the Central Valley, a huge part of everything I do is supported through partnerships with local agencies. I don't do anything without calling up the local agency and talking to them and getting their insights and their on-the-ground understanding of the groundwater system. So a key group of people, Cassie Jahan and others. And then when we acquire these data, we really need to be able to understand where the water table is. So as we were flying over, others were out there making water level measurements. And this paper was published last year in Environmental Research Letters, Open Access. Here's a shot of the helicopter out going over the dam at the base of the Kings River. And here are the data, which are truly phenomenal. So to the south, this was from a previous study. What you're looking at, it's a fence diagram where these are the data along all the airborne EM flight lines. And I'm showing this as resistivity, where the pink here is the bedrock of the Sierras. And then as we go from red, coarse-grained, down to blue is our clays. You can see in the southern part here, a lot of clays near the Sierras, and out in the valley, green. And it's just like, you mix yellow and blue, and what do you get? You get green. So this is telling us it's a lot of fine-grained material with coarse-grained material interlayered, but we don't have the resolving power to see these separately. So we are getting this green color, which tells us we've got this mixture of fine-grained and coarse-grained material. If you zoomed in, you would see this confining unit in blue here, which is the Corcoran clay. Okay, now I should have covered the northern part of this. I meant to do this because, ta-da, go to the north, and what do we see? We see this massive red feature. This is this incredibly coarse-grained, so therefore incredibly resistive feature. This is the incised valley fill deposit. So the white here is the alluvial fan of the Kings River. And this, look down here, how much fine-grained material it is. But no, up here, coming out where the Kings River was at this time, this huge feature, a coarse-grained, this is our incised valley fill deposit. So this was one of those, we found it. We can actually find these incised valley fill deposits with airborne EM data. And looking at some plan view slices, so this is looking at the resistivity from the surface down to 30 meters, which is where Gary and Graham said this deposit was located. And I've just outlined it in pink here, but the dash, dash, dash black line is exactly where they said it was going to be. And it's exactly where we found it. Now, there are other deposits in this area. I should have gone back. You can see other coarse-grained materials coming out, and it's very likely that there are other incised valley fill deposits that point back to this apex of the alluvial fan here. But as we slice down, and so this is a plan view map, and we are slicing down. As we slice farther down, once we get to between 40 and 50 meters, we get into this coarse-grained material, which is exactly how Gary and Graham described it, that you have this background of finer grain material, and then this coarse-grained deposit just comes tearing through. And so we have this coarse-grained deposit now. So now I'm looking at a slice through a cross section, starting in the Sierras, going out into the valley. Here's the bedrock of the Sierras, going out into the valley, going out 30 kilometers into the valley. And you see the red is the coarse-grained incised valley fill deposit, very close to the surface. There are places where there's fine-grained material between the surface and this deposit. There are places where it comes to the surface. And so the plan would be, if we can move surface water to these locations where this comes to the surface, we've got this, someone wrote an article and called it like nature's storm drain. We have a way of moving the water out, 30 kilometers out, to deeper sections in the Central Valley. And then this is looking across the fan in this location. And here in the center is where we have this incised valley fill deposits. And you can see coarse-grained deposits at greater depth. And the idea is to move the water out into this incised valley fill, and then it can access laterally other coarse-grained materials. Oh, and I didn't mention we've got driller's logs here, or from Gary and Graham, and the white circles are where we have cobbles present, which is a very distinctive feature of these incised valley fill deposits. So that was a recent true success story at the large scale in thinking about recharge in California. And something I'm a real advocate for, speaking to people in California, is when we start thinking about managing our groundwater resources, when we start thinking about anything, land use planning, zoning, let's figure out what nature is providing before we do anything else. And when it comes to recharge, if we can start better understanding the natural system and the natural infrastructure we have, I'm feeling like we should be using data such as this as the basis for any zoning, for any land use planning decision. And we should start having zoning for recharge as a standard way of thinking about land use planning in California. So meanwhile, while we're looking for these incised valley fill deposits, other things were going on because we have this Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and agencies need to understand the subsurface in order to sustainably manage their groundwater system, whether we're talking about recharge or larger scale management activities. And the question was, how do they get the data they need for this subsurface model that they need? And so I backed up a bit here. And now instead of focusing on recharge, I'm telling a bit of a story about why I now have an incredible data set available in California. And it's because in November 2016, after getting a number of successes with this airborne geophysical method, I partnered with Paul Goslin, who was at the Butte County Department of Water and Resource Conservation, and Graham Fogg at UC Davis. And we sent a white paper to the governor's office. And we said, you are trying to achieve sustainable groundwater management. You are never going to get there relying on drilling wells. And the sentence, there is a well-established geophysical method, the airborne electromagnetic method, which has the potential to make a significant contribution to the way we map and manage groundwater systems. And so we sent this to the governor's office. We lay lines on a map. We said it's going to require 20,000 line kilometers, $10 million, 2 years. Jesse Cruz helped us with this. The state came back and said, we're intrigued, but how would we do it? So I led a 2-year pilot project with many partners. And we developed and demonstrated the workflow for statewide acquisition. We said, these are the steps. These are the wells you need. This is the computational workflow from going from data to models. And you can see it all on a website, Mapwater, something like that, mapwater.stanford.edu. And just the whole workflow of you define what the management question is in the basin, you pull in all the existing data, you acquire your airborne EM data, you integrate the data. Well, the great news, in August 2021, the state launched $13 million for a 3-year project and acquired 27 line kilometers of airborne EM data. So I tell all my students now that it is really worth it occasionally to put your head up, forget about publishing in your academic journals, look around and say, where can we really put knowledge into action? Where is there an opportunity to make a big difference by changing the way things are being done? And I have to say, I am truly thrilled. Like 30 years of trying to get geophysical methods accepted for groundwater evaluation and management. It's one of those moments in your life where you go tick. So 2022, the UN declared their campaign around making the invisible visible. It was all about groundwater. And I thought, they're going to talk about geophysics all year. Well, they didn't, but something remarkable did happen in 2022. In December of last year, 25,000 kilometers of airborne EM data were released over the Central Valley of California. This is what we now have. So these are all those flight lines I've been showing you covering the Central Valley. We have this incredible data set. So zooming in, that we can now work with, not just for recharge, but for groundwater management more generally, and talk about making the invisible visible. I'm scrolling down here. We're between 13 and 17 meters, 17 meters to 26 meters. Here's my incised valley fill deposit, because this is not just the DWR data, but also our data. And you can just keep peeling away the layers, understanding the hydrogeology of the subsurface all the way down. We have good data all the way down to 300 meters. So in terms of this vision of using geophysical data to map out recharge, we have this airborne EM method that we can now use throughout the state. That's the tick mark. Depth of imaging, 300 meters. But we need more than this. This is great for those regional scale studies. It's great for looking for incised valley fill deposits along the base of the Sierras. But there's times when we need smaller scale measurements. We need a system that's a little easier to turn than a helicopter. We need a towed system. And there is now a towed electromagnetic system available. It's the towed equivalent of the airborne. This was developed by researchers at Aarhus University about 25 years ago now. It's called SkyTem, the system we use. This one's called T10, sky, EM, towed, EM. This sees to a depth of only 50 meters, but much better resolution. Well, when I heard that this was being built, I flew Esben, one of the key developers, over to Stanford in October 2017. Here's the system here. And we took it out to see, could we use this to complement the airborne system for getting higher resolution data at a smaller scale? So we went to an almond grove in the Tulare Irrigation District. And here's the system. This is an early version, a lot of duct tape, but the transmitter loop at the back. And this perfectly fit between the rows of almond trees. I had people making measurements for weeks before I flew it all over. It has to fit. I was afraid we were going to get jammed between the almond trees. And here's the system. And as you go, you are pinging the subsurface and making measurements approximately every 10 meters. It's as if you're drilling down and measuring the electrical resistivity of the subsurface. You can do it in an almond grove. It's a great way of operating in recharge basins. Here we are trying to understand the better places in the recharge basin in terms of infiltration. And one of my students who saw this said, as impressive as the technique is me actually driving the ATV. So then we come up with models of the subsurface. And here it is. This is a cutaway. So these are the rows of almond trees you can see underlying the image. And similar to flight lines, these are the lines along which we acquired data. Shown here now, I've converted it to the fraction of coarse-grained material. And you're mapping out where you have sands and gravels or your reds, where you have clays or your blues. And again, you can start using this to understand where we have pathways for recharge. And instead of using wells in this case, we used comb penetrometer testing to convert to sediment type. So where the story now all pulls together in terms of recharge is, back to my title, harnessing the power of geophysical imaging. We have these two geophysical imaging data sets. They're allowing us to efficiently map out where we have sand and gravel, where we have clay. And initially we were scrolling through these data using wonderful software, Leapfrog software, looking for pathways, but that's not a very efficient way to do this. So a paper led by Carissa Pepin, published in 2022 in Vadozone Journal, we said, how can we take data like these and efficiently look for pathways? And so what we did was to create a simple binary model of the subsurface. So this is my 3D subsurface model. So the surface is up here. This is my subsurface. And instead of having sand and gravel or clay at every location, I'm going to say, this is a unit through which water can flow. This is a unit through which water will not flow. And so I take my resistivity map, which allows me to go from resistivity to coarse fraction. And I define a cutoff. And I say any coarse fraction above this, I'm going to say is a flow unit. And any coarse fraction below this, I'm going to say is a no flow unit. And this is where you work with the end user. You work with the water manager, because this is uncertainty that's going to propagate through the workflow. And you want to, at this point, define flow, no flow in a way that acknowledges the tolerance for risk. So for example, if you're looking at an area and interpreting the data, and the worst thing in the world is to have water pond here, then you're going to have very low tolerance for mistakenly calling something flow. So even a little bit of clay, you're going to say, I'm going to call this a no flow unit. Alternatively, if your risk is missing a recharge opportunity, so there is no way you want to miss an opportunity to find a connected place, then you would do something very differently. Not until you have a lot of clay are you going to define it a no flow unit. So anyways, we go through this process, no flow, flow. We simulate spreading water on the ground surface. We start at all surface locations, and we use an iconal solver or fast marching algorithm to map out pathways. And we go from our starting images to plan view maps showing the length of the pathway from the surface to the water table. And the shorter the pathway, the better, because if there's a clay layer in the way and your path has to go way over here, you are not going to recharge there. So color scheme's a bit crazy here, but red means recharge here, which kind of goes with the coarse grain units. And this is what we've now been working on, is developing, we're finalizing and developing all the software required to convert geophysical data throughout the state to plan view maps like this. And this brings me back to my title, which is actually the title of a project I have right now, funded by what's called the Accelerator in our new Stanford Doerr School for Sustainability. And the Accelerator is a new opportunity we have at Stanford for faculty such as me that have ideas, and you really need the resources to push it over the edge, to turn it into something that others can work with, the whole knowledge into action that I love. And so through the Accelerator, you could get up to $1 million, but you had to be done in 1 year. And you had to show how you could take your idea and scale it and get it out there. And we were awarded one of these Accelerator grants. My year is up August 1st, so it's a bit busy around here right now, but we're going to make it. We have this project, and my group at Stanford are partnering with software developers, Rowan Cockett and Steve Perz at CurveNote, and we are taking all that we've done and turning it into a web-based app. The COI is the Deputy Director for Sustainable Groundwater Management at DWR. I have tons of partners, and we are developing this web-based software package. And we're developing the online training to go with it. And we have completed this whole computational workflow to go from our geophysical image to our final map. And this is what we're generating. And I'm going to skip to the end because I see I'm getting close to out of time. But we've got a database where we've pulled in all the geophysical data, all the well-based data, and you can access it all. It'll be live probably in September, this web-based software package to download publicly available geophysical data, publicly available geophysical data, and map out recharge pathways in California. So just finish with some acknowledgements. Funding, again, the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation has been huge. A number of other sources of funding for this entire package that I've talked about. And then, of course, nothing's ever possible without my students, my postdocs, my research scientists, and many partners. And for more details, you can see my website, GemCenter, at stanford.edu. Now I'm going to try and stop sharing. Okay. Great. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Rosemary. That was really exciting. I have to tell you, I mean, I thought the stuff I'd read about this was interesting, but I actually got chills when you showed some of those results towards the end. I mean, and I'm always saying this to students, that as a scientist, if you have the opportunity to be involved in work that's actually going to make a difference, particularly if you're an environmental scientist and people want to hear what you have to say, that's really exciting. But this is of a scale that's really mind-boggling to me. I mean, the magnitude of the problem is so large.
I used to say to my PhD students, okay, you have 2 things you need to accomplish during your PhD. The first Nobel Prize in geophysics and save the planet. And if you run out of time, focus on number 2.
Excellent. So I have posted a request for people, they may or may not have seen it in the chat. I basically said, if you have a question, just let us know in the chat. We'll invite you to unmute and ask your question. While we're waiting a moment to see if anybody has something they want to post there, I'm just going to actually turn it over to Claire. Claire, you have anything you want to add or ask?
I do
have a question I'll ask afterwards. If Claire
I have a couple questions, that these are kind of standard. So there are 2 questions. So first of all, with recharge, there's always an issue of water quality, depending on what the end use is of the recharged water. So I don't know if you've been working in that realm with your partners.
Yeah. So that's not where we work. We work primarily on, are there coarse-grained materials? Can we make the water down? But doing work Kate Mahar at Stanford is taking some of the models we're producing and putting them into ParFlow and simulating, like especially when you work in agricultural areas where you've got past pesticide use, nitrates hung up in the root zone. What is the pathway for these nitrates? For how long are you likely to be seeing increased nitrates in the drinking water? And there's also a large group at UC Davis, Helen Dahlke, Thomas Harder, working on really focused on AgMAR, managed aquifer recharge in agricultural areas, and this whole question of what do we need to do in terms of water quality and how do we think about that? Yeah, so that's huge. We are not working on that area.
And I guess one related question to that always comes up with recharge applications. Again, you're not working on the water quality is, clogging,
Right.
like clogging pores with sediments, which
Yeah, so we did a super interesting study with another type of sensor using a distributed temperature sensor many years ago. And we laid out a line, we put it a meter below a recharge pond and then put one at the top. And that allowed us to watch the thermal signature move through. And so we could monitor over time the change in infiltration rate in a pond. And what was a very interesting result was over time, this system converged on some average permeability. And it really makes sense. The areas that are most permeable at the start, that's where all the water goes. But that's also where your clogging occurs. So once you mess those up, it's like, oh, let's move over here. So what we saw was this convergence of permeability. The ones that were most permeable to start saw the most rapid reduction in permeability.
And so one final question. So again, this is not your mission, but I mean, I guess you wouldn't expect to be able to recover much of the subsidence because once you've crushed the matrix is not necessarily recoverable. I mean, is that anything anyone's looked at all?
Oh, yeah, we've looked at it and we've quantified the amount that's non-recoverable. But we've also now done some really detailed modeling of Matt Lee's paper. It was in, I can't remember where we published it last year. And where you get the largest amount of compaction is when your head level drops below your historic lowest head level. So because you're allowing the grains to reorganize, if you stay above your minimum head level, you stay in the elastic regime. It's recoverable. It goes down, it comes up, it goes down, it comes up, it goes down, it comes up. So this is what we're saying strategically is where to recharge. You need to go to those places immediately that are about to go below their minimum historic head level.
Right. It may be lost on the students that don't study groundwater that you can't always put that volume back, but that's really an interesting criterion. That's really cool. Okay,
And
Andy.
once the clays rearrange, that's their new standard. You can't pop them open again.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question. I still don't see any posted here, but I hope we'll get a couple. So this has been, as anybody in California knows, but certainly most of us on the East Coast who've been paying attention to the weather know, it's been an extraordinary year. I think California was hit by something like 16 atmospheric rivers. I don't know if I've got that exactly right.
Something like that, yeah.
There's an awful lot of snowpack up there in the mountains, and I guess it's going to start to melt if it hasn't already started to melt pretty soon. If this system that you're talking about were actually in place to the point where you could start to implement, how would you actually manage the process of getting the water to the places where you want the recharge to take place? This is a massive scale thing, but like if you had another year like this, once you're at that point, it strikes, I don't even know what the volume of water is, but it strikes me as an extraordinary opportunity.
Right. And this is what people other than me are working on right now. So we already have in California the infrastructure for moving surface water around. So a lot of the snow melt water is captured in reservoirs. And then there's controlled release of that surface water. And if we're not dealing with flooding, there's a release during the warmer months when it's needed for agriculture, and it goes from the reservoir into an aqueduct. And then locally, the various irrigation districts keep track of, I don't really understand all of it, but you open this and it goes into this canal, and then these people open this and it goes into these irrigation ditches. So there's already this very complicated system of moving this bucket of surface water to this grower in this location. So now we've got floods, and when we talk about floodmar, it's not just capturing flood water, it's also capturing water, it's also using water in anticipation of a flood. So we have a reservoir and we have a huge snowmelt predicted to happen. So we start releasing reservoir water early. We can use that same infrastructure that we have in place for delivering water for irrigation during the growing season and get it to growers if they're willing to take this extra water and flood their land with it. What's now being designed are ways of tapping into aqueducts or to this surface water system to move water to new locations that we hadn't previously thought about as being locations for recharge. So we're in reasonably good shape because of this network that's already moving water around for irrigation.
Fascinating. Yeah, I used to, didn't actually have a copy, but I remember leafing through the old California Water Atlas. It's published, I don't know how many years ago, which had these spectacular maps and sort of showed how all the infrastructure was connected, but I haven't seen that in a while. So we have a couple of questions in here now. We have, I'm going to start with, so Aaron, I guess you're telling me there's a bunch of students in the lab, but they don't have a microphone, so I'm going to read their questions. So this is from Philip Worster, one of our master's students. He says, awesome presentation, thank you. I'm wondering your opinion on where you might expect this technology to be used in future research opportunities.
So there's all sorts of opportunities for using these technologies for any time we need to understand the critical zone. You know, any scientific questions that need an understanding of what's the architecture of the subsurface, what's the depth to bedrock. Oh, Claire, we did a study years ago in Baltimore trying to figure out depth to bedrock. You know, so for understanding the architecture of the subsurface, this is essential. And, you know, I had a call from someone in Arizona. Could you come to Arizona and do in Arizona what you did in California? I had a Zoom with a large group in Africa a month ago. Could you come to Africa and do in Africa? So anywhere people are trying to manage groundwater resources, there's obviously a need to understand the architecture of the subsurface. But many other compelling science questions that we're facing require an understanding of the subsurface. So this is a way, you know, it's hard to write the $600,000 you need for an airborne EM survey into your NSF grant, which is why studies like this haven't been done widely. It's just very expensive. And, but it's not saying it's not possible.
Okay, so I have another question from Emma Gilligan, who asks, what is your top tip for making outreach to politicians regarding one's research results as effective as possible?
Sorry, I missed that a bit. What's
your top tip for making outreach to politicians regarding one's research results as effective as possible?
Okay, so first, don't assume they're going to.
How do you talk with politicians to actually get the point across to make that knowledge transfer to make the results more effective?
Well, practice before you're in a room with a politician so that you've learned how to give a talk that uses the word groundwater instead of aquifer, for example. So first learn to communicate in ways that everyone gets it. And then what I did in this case in California, because I was really struggling, like I've been talking about this for 15 years using airborne EM in California. And what someone advised me to do was you need to work at the two levels. You need to get to the top, but you need to get the grassroots at the bottom. So I really took the grassroots. I was out in the Central Valley establishing partners. I went to every meeting I was invited to with water managers and water agencies and just talk. That's why I'm hoarse, 15 years of talking. No, so work locally, get the people who are lobbying the politicians on your side. And then you actually do need access to the governor's office. And that was arranged through Graham Fogg at UC Davis. We gave a presentation to the planning and policy. I forget who it was. But you actually need to get in the door and give a knock your socks off presentation. And then you get to send a white paper. So that's my experience. That's what I did. But it's work locally, work with the people who are lobbying government. And then another good tip someone told me recently is don't lobby government, staff government. So it's a former PhD student of mine who's actually leading this airborne EM survey effort at the Department of Water Resources. And it's a former student of mine that's now leading in the consulting company that's being contracted to do. So get good people out there and get them not looking for faculty positions, but interested in spending their lives working with public agencies and in government and in public service. That's the best way we can have an impact.
I've got a bunch of students listening who are listening to every word you're saying. I'm going to read a couple more of these questions. Jana Diamond, I don't know whether you are in the room with the other graduate, where you are, if you want to unmute, or if you're one of the people who doesn't have a mic.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. This was a really exciting story. I was wondering how you would account for the moisture content in the soil. Like, would you have to recalibrate if it had just rained before you take the measurements, and how would you go about that?
Great question. So I skimmed over a lot. The resolution that you're getting in both your towed system, well, first of all, the resolution in your towed system, you can resolve probably the top half meter or so. And then with the airborne EM data, you're resolving sort of the top meter. And the fact that water content is changing in that top layer just influences how you calibrate going from resistivity to sediment type. And I flew by it very quickly, but the resistivity distributions in the unsaturated zone, in the vadose zone, tend to be much broader than they are in the saturated zone. And this is because, say for sand, in the unsaturated zone, my resistivity goes all the way, it's going to be lower when it's just rained, and it's going to be higher when it's bone dry. So my resistivity range for my sand can cover this very large distance. When I get below the water table, it's all saturated. So having just rained or not is just going to change how broad the distribution is. But with everything else going on, it's not something you need to be concerned about. What you do need to be concerned about is where's the water table? Because the transform between sediment type, between resistivity and sediment type, is very different. This is my curve that I'm drawing. This is my resistivity curve. It's like this above the water table. It's like that below the water table, and it's shifted. So that's the measurement you need to get people running around doing for you while you're flying overhead. You need to know where the water table is.
Okay, we'll make this the last question. Mohammed RF posted a question. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Hello? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
I can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. I mean, my hello from Berlin. I have two questions. The first question is, first of all, thank you for great presentation. And would you consider implementing this technology in a project to build an underground dam? I mean, as a kind of possibility, because you mentioned about recharge, and I was wondering if you consider this underground dam constructions as a
Yeah,
kind of...
so data such as these help you understand what's present in the subsurface. So any sort of engineering or construction project where you need, sorry, my voice. If you're trying to excavate in an area or put in some tunnel or underground dam, I'm not familiar with underground dams, but if there is value in knowing what the sediment type is, which I imagine there is if you're excavating something like that, geophysical measurements such as these tell you what's there. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I have one second question. So I was wondering if you could use this data for INSAR, in combination of INSAR for modeling the deformation rate.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're, I obviously need to give a 10-hour talk because I skipped through too much too quickly. But what we are doing right now, we have a NASA funded project where we are integrating the INSAR data with the airborne EM data to come up with a groundwater model in the San Joaquin Valley where we can predict the subsidence. And so the common factor, the INSAR deformation, contains information about clay content. The airborne electromagnetic data contains information about clay content. Anytime you have a common parameter, you can do a joint inversion. and you can start integrating the two data sets. So through this clay content information, that's how we're coupling the INSAR measurements and the airborne EM measurements.
Okay. So I think we're about ready to close. Before we turn off the recording, is there anything last comments you want to make, Claire?
No, thank you very much. That was fantastic. That was just super. We would love to be able to use these methods in urban areas, but you know the issues with urban, right?
There are issues in urban, but there's
Yeah,
other
I can't do the
geophysical methods.
flyovers. You would, yeah, if I get killed.
Yes,
But and then
I
there's always-
should have said that you cannot fly in urban areas because there's a non-zero risk this is going to fall off. So FAA wouldn't allow it. And also interference from power lines.
right. And then, yeah, you know, but and then there's interference with a lot of things, but doing any geophysical methods in urban areas. But that's our, you know, we'd love to adopt some of these ideas to urban areas to see the architecture, which includes all of our pipes and everything. Yeah.
Right. Oh, you do ground penetrating radar.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you
Okay.
very much for the invitation. Thank you for hosting.
Thanks so
Okay,
much. And
thank you.
once we get the recording back, I'll send you the link. I think I mean, if you're looking for, you know, I'm sure you've been given many, many presentations, but I think this will speak very well to sort of the broad picture for broad audience. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm
Take
going
care.
to turn off
Thanks.
the recording.
Bye-bye.
now.
Bye.